Montana Territory, September 1882. The wind howled across the Bitterroot Valley, throwing dust against the windows of the old stagecoach station where Willow Langford stood, her arms wrapped around her two children. She stared down the road, praying for a miracle, because if nobody came soon, they would not survive the week. She had not planned on being stranded with only a satchel of dry biscuits, 2 worn blankets, and 2 children too young to understand why their father had left them. But here she was 29, widowed, and abandoned by the only man who was supposed to help get them west to a better life. He took the wagon, the money, and vanished while she was inside the station tending to her youngest's fever. "Toby, give your sister her shawl," Willow said, her voice tight from exhaustion. "It is getting colder." Toby, 8 years old and trying hard to be braver than he felt, nodded and helped little Tessa wrap up. Tessa, barely 5, leaned into her mother's side, her cheeks flushed from the fever still clinging to her. Willow pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and closed her eyes. She had no plan left. No money. No wagon. No one to call on. Her only choice was to wait, hope someone passed through before the cold nights turned deadly. The crunch of hooves in dry dirt snapped her head up. A rider was coming, slow but steady, cutting across the dusk like salvation. He was alone, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered and calm like he had time to spare. As he got closer, she could see his face, dark hair under a dusty hat, sharp features softened by a look of quiet focus. His coat was worn, boots scuffed, but there was something steady in the way he held the reins. He dismounted with the ease of someone who had been riding since childhood and tied off his horse. "You folks all right?" he asked, voice low and even. Willow hesitated. She had not trusted a man since her husband proved just how easy it was to walk away. But she had 2 children beside her, and hunger did not wait. "We were supposed to be headed to Missoula," she said. "But my husband stole our wagon and left us here 4 days ago." The man's jaw tightened. "You got food?" "Enough for maybe another day." He looked down at the children. Tessa coughed, and the man's gaze softened. "I got coffee and beans in my saddlebags. Firewood too. Let me help." "I do not know your name," Willow said, keeping her voice firm. "Quinn Barrett," he said, tugging off his gloves. "Headed north to timber country. But I can stay the night. Nobody should be left out here with sick kids and no fire." Willow studied him. His eyes were a warm gray, focused and kind. She nodded slowly. "Willow Langford. This is Toby. And Tessa." Quinn gave a small nod to each child, then got to work. He did not ask questions or talk much, just built a fire, boiled water, and shared his food as if it was the most natural thing in the world. By the time the stars were out, the children were asleep under the blankets with full bellies and flushed cheeks. Willow sat by the fire across from Quinn, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. She had not tasted anything that good in weeks. "You are not like most men," she said quietly. Quinn looked at her, the firelight catching the edge of a scar on his jaw. "Most men would have kept riding," she added. "I had a younger sister once," he said. "She died when she was 10. Fever took her fast. I still think about her every time I see a sick child. Maybe that is why I stopped." Willow nodded, silence settling between them. But it was not the kind that felt heavy. It was the kind that let her breathe easier. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "My brother has a farm near Missoula. I was supposed to help him with the harvest and start over. I thought maybe we could finally have something steady." "And him? The man who left you?" Her fingers tightened around the cup. "He was not my husband. Just a man who offered to take us west for a price. I gave him everything I had. He waited until I went inside to get water, then vanished with the wagon and the rest of the food." Quinn did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was like flint striking stone. "That kind of man deserves to rot." Willow looked across at him and felt something shift. This man did not pity her. He saw her. That mattered more than she expected. The next morning, Quinn saddled his horse and packed his things. Willow folded up the blankets slowly, trying not to let the panic rise. "Will you keep going?" she asked. "Not without you," he said simply. She blinked. "You and the kids. I will take you to Missoula. I know a shortcut through the hills. We will be there in 3 days." "Why would you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I want to. Because you deserve better than being left behind." Toby stepped forward before Willow could say anything. "Can I ride your horse?" Quinn smiled just a little. "You can ride with me, but only if you promise not to fall asleep." Toby grinned. Willow's heart twisted at the sight. She took Tessa's hand and looked at Quinn. "All right, we will go with you." He helped them up, tied their bag to the saddle, and lifted Tessa in front of Willow. Toby rode with him, laughing as the horse started forward. They traveled quietly, stopping by streams to rest and cook. At night, Quinn made sure the children were warm, and Willow caught him glancing at her when he thought she was not looking. She felt safer around him than she had in years. On the second night, they camped near a creek, and Quinn sat beside her while the children slept. "You are strong," he said. She stared into the fire. "I do not feel strong." "You are still standing. That is strength." She looked at him then, really looked. He had calloused hands, a quiet way of watching everything, and a steadiness that felt like shelter. She reached out slowly, touched his hand. He did not pull away. "You are kind," she whispered. Quinn turned his hand over and held hers. "Maybe I just finally met someone worth stopping for." Willow's breath caught. Nobody had ever said that to her. She leaned in, and he did too, their foreheads touching before either of them moved. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was just right. They reached Missoula on the third day. Her brother welcomed them in, surprised and grateful. But when Quinn turned to go, Willow caught his arm. "You are not leaving." He looked down at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I want you to stay. We want you to stay." Tessa ran up and hugged Quinn's leg. Toby stood beside him like he had always been there. Quinn looked at them, then at Willow. He set down his bag and smiled, his eyes warm and full of something real. "Then I am home." The Langfords and Quinn Barrett had been under the same roof for only 3 weeks, but already the rhythm of their days had begun to settle into something that resembled peace. Willow's brother, Amos, had given them a corner of his small clapboard house outside Missoula, a back room with patched flooring and a narrow window that opened to the woods. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, and there were chores enough for everyone. Quinn rose before dawn, always the first to the fields. He never said much in the early hours, just nodded to Amos and took his place behind the plow or among the fencing tools. His strength a welcome addition to the harvest efforts. Willow watched from the kitchen window sometimes, her hands deep in biscuit dough as he bent to lift sacks of grain or mended the railings without being asked. He worked with a quiet precision, as if he'd always belonged to the earth and knew exactly how to move through it without stirring the dust too much. Toby had taken to following him like a colt, eager to help or just listen. On the 4th morning, as Quinn repaired a broken wheel on the seed cart, the boy edged close with a stick in hand and wide eyes. "Did you always work on farms?" "No," Quinn said without looking up. "Grew up around horses mostly. My father bred Morgans in Nebraska." "What made you come here?" Quinn flicked a splinter from his thumb and sat back on his heels. "Things change. Sometimes you stay. Sometimes you ride on. Montana felt right this time." Toby nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than he should. "You think you'll stay now?" Quinn looked toward the house, where the window curtain fluttered slightly, as if someone had just stepped away from it. "I think I might." Inside, Willow poured buttermilk into a crock and kept her eyes on the churn. She hadn't meant to listen, but the words settled around her like a soft shawl. She hadn't asked him to stay, not outright, but he hadn't left either. And every day he stayed, she let herself believe a little more in the possibility of something new. Later that afternoon, Willow stood at the edge of the maple grove behind the house, gathering kindling while Tessa napped under her sister-in-law's care. The leaves had begun to turn, sharp reds and burnished golds, and the smell of damp bark and wood smoke wrapped around her like a memory she couldn't quite place. She stooped to pick up a branch but paused when she heard footsteps behind her. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Quinn said, stepping into view. "There's been grizzlies sighted near the river bend." Willow straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I didn't go far. Just needed some air." He nodded, glancing down at the bundle in her arms. "You always do more than your share. I don't like feeling useless." "You're not." She looked up sharply. "Maybe not to you. But Amos and his wife, they've done enough already. I can't stay here forever." "I know." She waited, but he didn't say more. The wind pulled at her shawl and she clutched it tighter. "I never planned on coming west to live off charity. I wrote letters for months trying to find work. I thought I had a place lined up in Helena as a school tutor. But when they found out I had children, they stopped answering." Quinn's brow furrowed. "That's not right." "It's just how it is," she said. "I even considered, well, there was this ad in the Denver Gazette. Mail order bride requests, you know. A woman can't live on dreams, and no one hires a widow with 2 mouths to feed." He stepped closer, his boots silent in the soft moss. "Did you answer any?" She nodded slowly. 3. One man wrote back, said I was too picky, that I asked too many questions. The others never replied. "What kind of questions?" "I asked if they'd be willing to let me teach, if they'd raise my children like their own, if they believed in kindness over pride. I suppose that was too much to ask." Quinn's voice dropped. "It wasn't." She looked at him then, really looked at the way his face held traces of long rides and harder years, but none of it had turned him bitter. "You never asked anything of me, Quinn. Not once." "I didn't need to," he said simply. "You've already shown me everything I'd ever hoped for in a woman." She swallowed, her throat tight. "You hardly know me. I know how Tessa climbs into your lap without asking and how you hum when you're folding sheets. I've seen the way you hold Toby's hand when he's scared, even when you're tired. I know enough." She turned away, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. A silence settled between them again, but it wasn't awkward. It held. Back at the house, Amos called from the front porch, his voice carrying over the trees. "Quinn, got a neighbor down the road with a broken axle. Needs help before nightfall." Quinn glanced toward the sound, then back at Willow. "I'll go." "You all right here?" She nodded. "We'll finish supper. Be careful." He touched the brim of his hat and turned, disappearing through the trees. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Willow folded a fresh shirt Quinn had left drying near the hearth. She ran her fingers over the stitching small, even men's near the cuffs, and thought of all the things she'd given up believing in. Safety, companionship, a man who asked nothing but gave everything in return. The next morning, 2 letters arrived by post, both addressed to Amos but one bearing her name in the corner. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was from one of the men she had written to months ago, a rancher near Cheyenne. He apologized for not responding sooner and said he had recently lost his intended bride to illness. He offered again room, board, and the promise of marriage if she were still interested. He mentioned his property, his cattle, his need for a woman to keep house and raise children. He did not ask about her wishes, only if she were willing to come quickly. She folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer beneath the flour tin. 3 days passed before she mentioned it to Quinn. They were walking the perimeter fence together, checking for gaps where the cattle might push through. Willow wore her brother's old coat and Quinn carried a coil of wire over one shoulder. "I had a letter," she said. He paused without looking at her. "From who?" "Man I'd written before. Said he still needed a wife." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You thinking of going?" "I don't know." She looked out across the hills, where the sky had gone pale with autumn. "He has a ranch. Money. He says he wants someone steady." "You want steady?" "I want to be wanted." Quinn turned then, fixing her with a look that rooted her to the ground. You are. She took a breath. You never said so. I didn't think I had to. She stepped closer. But if I leave, I won't stop you. But I won't pretend it wouldn't tear something out of me. She reached for his hand, felt the roughness of it, the warmth. I don't want a man who sees me as a task, she said. I want someone who sees me as his choice. Every day. I do. The wire slipped from his shoulder. Forgotten. He pulled her close, and this time, there was no hesitation. She tipped her face toward his, and the kiss that followed was slow, sure, and full of everything they hadn't yet said. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest. I'm not going to Cheyenne, she whispered. I know. They stood like that for a long time, the wind rustling through the tall grass around them. The rancher's letter stayed in the drawer unopened again, and Willow never looked back. The first frost came sudden and hard, silvering the fields before dawn and stiffening the boards on the barn roof. It crept beneath door jambs and window panes, made the hens hissy and sluggish, turned breath to fog in the early morning hush. Willow rose that morning before the rooster, wrapping Tessa in a flannel shawl and easing from the mattress so as not to wake her. The girl had taken to curling against her back in the nights, her small hands resting on the curve of her mother's spine as though anchoring them both. She padded through the dark kitchen, struck a match, and lit the stove. The wood caught slow, reluctant in the cold, but it warmed the room enough that her fingertips no longer ached. She started dough for cornmeal cakes, listening to the soft snores from the far room where Quinn and Toby now shared a narrow cot. Since the day she'd told him she wouldn't be leaving, he had quietly rearranged his life around theirs, never intruding, never asking, simply folding himself into their pattern like he had always been meant to. By the time the sun crested the pine ridge, the house smelled of coffee and burnt cornmeal. Quinn stepped into the kitchen, hair still damp from the water pump, shirt clinging slightly across his chest where droplets hadn't dried. You're up early, he said, voice still soft with sleep. I wanted a quiet moment before the day started. She passed him a mug, her fingers brushing his. The frost came heavy. He sipped and nodded. We'll need to tarp the haystack and check the feed stores. I saw Amos hauling sacks yesterday. He's been favoring his left leg again. Quinn gave a thoughtful grunt, then pulled on his coat. I'll see to it. And take Toby, he's been itching to learn the grain weight scale. Willow raised a brow. You trust him not to tip it over just to see what happens? I trust him to figure out what happens when he does. She laughed quietly, and he leaned in, brushing his lips against her temple. It was new, this easy affection, but it steadied her like nothing else had in years. After breakfast, while the men went to the barn, Willow took Tessa out to the edge of the woods with a basket and a small belt knife. The child's cough had eased in the dry autumn air, and she was back to chasing beetles and chattering about moss. Willow knelt to trim slender stalks of mullein, the leaves soft and gray-green. Can I carry some? Tessa asked, holding out her apron. You can hold the flowers. They help with earaches. The girl nodded solemnly, cradling the yellow blooms like treasure. As they gathered, Willow's mind drifted to the letter still in the flower tin drawer. She hadn't touched it since the day it arrived, but the words had sunk roots. Not because she regretted her choice, but because they reminded her of how easily a woman could be discarded when her needs didn't fit a man's shape. Do you remember anything about your father? She asked quietly, not looking at Tessa. The girl hummed. He had a loud laugh, and he hated onions. Willow smiled faintly. That's true. She didn't speak of the man, often hadn't been able to, not without bitterness. But the memory of him had grown smaller in her mind, like a pebble worn smooth by water. Not forgotten, just no longer sharp. They returned with full baskets, and Willow set about drying the herbs near the hearth. She'd begun building a small apothecary, jars and bundles lining the corner shelf. Her brother's wife, Mary, had taken notice. You've got a real hand for this, she said that afternoon, watching Willow mix a salve for cracked lips. There's a midwife over near Mill Creek who's been looking for help. She's getting on in years. Willow glanced up. I haven't delivered a child since my sister's second. And that was 6 years ago. She'd teach you. You've got the calm for it. It settled in her chest like a warm coal. The idea of being useful in that way of carving a place not just for survival but for purpose was something she hadn't let herself want in a long time. That evening, she mentioned it to Quinn as they walked the fence line. Tessa on his shoulders and Toby trailing behind with a stick he used to whittle nonsense shapes into the dirt. She said I could apprentice with her through winter, Willow said. Help with tinctures. Learn the birthing side come spring. Quinn looked over at her, his pace slowing. Would you want that? I think I would. It'd give us more footing. And I'd like to be known for something again. You already are, he said gently. But I think you should do it. You've got good instincts. And a steady hand. She reached out, brushing her fingers against his. He caught her hand in his, holding it as they walked. You wouldn't mind if I was gone sometimes? I'd mind if you felt you had to ask. They stopped near the gate, the sky-streaked rose and gold above the hills. I don't know how we got here, she said, voice quiet. I never thought I'd have this again. We didn't get here all at once, he said. We got here one choice at a time. He leaned down then, kissed her slow, Tessa giggling above them. Yuck, the girl said, and they both laughed, the moment light and sure. Over the next few weeks, Willow began making the ride to Mill Creek twice a week, bundled in a borrowed coat with a satchel full of dried herbs and notebooks. The midwife, Mrs. Densley, was gray-haired and sharp-tongued, but she took to Willow quickly, teaching her how to judge pulses, how to ease swelling, how to listen when pain spoke through silence. Some evenings, she came home bone-tired, her hands stained with tincture residue and her mind full of Latin names. Quinn would meet her at the gate, take her horse's reins, and lead her inside without a word. He had built her a second shelf for her supplies, carved her initials into the side. One night, she found a new mortar and pestle wrapped in cloth on the table. No note, just the gift sturdy, well-balanced, and clearly made by his own hand. She traced the handle with her thumb. I've never had someone give me something just because they thought I'd use it, she said. You make things that help people, Quinn replied. That matters. Winter crept in by inches, first in the way the chickens huddled closer to the coop walls, then in the way the stove stayed lit even through the afternoon. The children grew quieter in the evenings, content to sketch or read by lamplight. Toby had taken to copying passages from one of Amos's old almanacs, determined to learn weather signs. Tessa had learned to thread needles, sitting beside Mary by the fire. One night, as snow fell thick and soundless, Willow stood beside Quinn on the porch, watching the flakes vanish into the dark. I was thinking, she said, we ought to build something of our own come spring. He didn't respond right away, but his fingers laced through hers. What kind of something? Not just a house. A place where we can live without leaning on anyone, where the children can sleep without worry, and I can keep my jars in full sun. He looked out over the field beyond the barn, the snow already softening its edges. There's a parcel of land west of here, he said eventually. Belongs to a man I knew from timber work. He's moving back east. Said he'd sell it cheap to the right person. She turned to him, her heart beating steady. You think we're the right people? I think we're exactly who that land's been waiting for. She smiled then, full and sure, the wind tugging at her hair. I want to build it with you, she said. Not just the house, the life. He turned, cupped her face in his hand. Then let's start drawing plans. And in the hush of snowfall, wrapped in the warmth of something earned slowly and held with care, Willow knew there were no more letters to write, no more questions to ask. She had found her answer in the man who had simply stayed and in the life they would build, one quiet day at a time. By early March, the snow had thinned to patches, stubborn in shadowed places beneath the eaves and along the north-facing fence posts. The land, after so many months of silence, had begun to stir again, mud rising beneath boot heels, birds returning in cautious flocks to the bare branches. Willow stood at the edge of the field behind Amos's barn, the wind tugging gently at her wool skirt, her eyes following the line of trees that marked the western boundary. She had come out to think, but the land kept interrupting her. A red fox darted through the brush, its coat ragged from winter. A hawk circled high above, riding the breeze with lazy purpose. And in the distance, just visible through the thinning mist, the parcel Quinn had spoken of 50 acres of unworked soil, a shallow creek, and a gentle slope on which to build. Quinn had gone that morning with Amos to speak to the landowner. It wasn't a promise, not yet, just talk. But even talk had weight when it came from Quinn's mouth. He didn't barter in dreams he wouldn't carry through. Willow turned back toward the house, her boots sinking slightly in the softening earth. At the porch, Mary was kneeling with Tessa, showing her how to press seeds into the shallow furrows of a wooden tray. Even if they're small, Mary was saying, they'll grow. You just have to wait. Tessa's brow furrowed. What if they don't come up? Then we try again. Willow stepped up beside them. I've been thinking about planting calendula this year. For poultices. Mary wiped her hands on her apron. You'll need a second drying rack. I plan to build one. Mary studied her a long moment, then nodded. You always do what you say, don't you? Willow offered the smallest of smiles. I try. Inside, Toby was hunched over a low table, shaping a piece of pine with his pocket knife. He didn't look up as Willow passed, but she paused to watch the way his hands moved, careful, deliberate. He had taken to carving things lately, birds, fence rails, even a tiny spoon that Quinn now used to stir his coffee. The boy hadn't said much about it, but Willow saw the way his shoulders had squared in recent weeks, how he lingered a little longer near Quinn's side, how his voice no longer trembled when he asked questions. She left him to his work and went to the root cellar, stepping down into the cool dark to check her dwindling stores. The potatoes were beginning to sprout and the carrots had gone limp at the edges. She made a note in her mind to boil them that evening, maybe mash them with salt if they still held flavor. Spring was coming, but not fast enough for the pantry. By afternoon, the wind had shifted again, sharper now, carrying the bite of distant snow. She was hauling a bucket of water from the pump when she saw Quinn's horse returning. He rode slow, hat low against the wind, his frame relaxed in the saddle. When he dismounted, he didn't speak at first, just led the horse to the trough and began unbuckling the girth strap. Well? Willow asked, wiping a damp palm on her skirt. He looked at her then, and his eyes held something steady. He'll sell. But he wants it done before the thaw finishes. Says he's got kin in Chicago willing to take him in, but the train fare won't wait. Willow's heart lifted and then, just as quick, settled again under the weight of practical questions. How much? Less than he asked in autumn. He's eager to go. She hesitated. We don't have much saved. I have enough, he said. From the timber job last winter. I've been keeping it back. For what? For this. Willow's throat tightened. You should have told me. I didn't want you to think I was trying to buy something. I just wanted to be ready in case you ever said yes. She stepped forward, her hand closing around the edge of the water bucket. It's not about the land. I know. She watched him a long moment, then set the bucket down. We'll need a draft team, lumber, nails. I've already spoken to Amos. He's got a line on a sawyer who trades for labor. Willow crossed her arms, the wind cutting between them. You always think ahead. I've had time to learn what happens when you don't. There was no heat in his voice, just truth. She nodded and they stood there a while, the cold wind curling between them, the future taking shape in the space between one breath and the next. That evening, they spread a rough map across the table inside, pushing aside Mary's sewing and Toby's carvings. Quinn pointed to a gentle rise near the creek. There, he said. South-facing. Good light. Dry ground. Willow tapped a spot just beyond it. And a shed here. For herbs and drying racks. Toby leaned in. Can we build a coop too? Quinn nodded. But only if you help dig the post holes. The boy grinned and ran to fetch a pencil to mark it on the map. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Willow and Quinn stood by the hearth, the coals glowing low and red. She reached up, brushed soot from his collar. "You always give space," she said. "Even when I didn't know how much I needed it. I figured you'd come to me when you were ready." She tilted her head. "How could you be so sure?" "I wasn't. But I knew I'd rather wait than push." She stepped closer, her voice barely audible above the crackle of coal. "I've never had that before." He touched her cheek, his thumb warm against her skin. "You have it now." They stayed like that a long time, the hush between them not from hesitation, but from something settled and whole. The next morning, Quinn rode out with Amos to begin clearing the plot, and Willow packed a basket of bread, salt pork, and a jar of pickled onions. She sent Toby with it, bundled in a too-large coat, his face flushed with the importance of the task. With the house quiet, Willow took down her sewing kit and began stitching new curtains from an old flour sack. The fabric was coarse, but it held the scent of sun and grain, and she liked the thought of it hanging in their new home, something humble and honest. Mary came in from the yard, brushing hay from her sleeves. "You know," she said, watching Willow's needle move, "I never thought you'd stay. First week you were here, you slept with your boots near the door. I was waiting to be told to leave." Mary sat across from her. "Amos doesn't say much, but he's glad. We both are." Willow nodded, her fingers pausing. "It feels different now. Like I'm not just passing through." "You're not." They sat in companionable silence, the only sound the soft pull of thread and the wind at the windows. By late March, the snow had vanished entirely, leaving behind slick earth and the deep scent of thawed pine. Quinn returned each evening with mud on his boots and fresh scrapes on his hands. The children took to meeting him at the gate, peppering him with questions. Each night, Willow washed his shirts, mended his cuffs, and listened as he described where the beams would go, how the joists would be set. One night, he came in carrying a bundle wrapped in burlap. He set it on the table and unwrapped it to reveal a hand-carved beam brace. "I know it's early," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but I wanted you to have the first piece." Willow traced the edge of the wood, the grain smoothed by his touch. "Did you carve this?" He nodded. "Out of the maple Amos felled last fall. Figured it should be yours." She ran her fingers over the notches, her voice quiet. "It's beautiful. It's strong." She looked up at him, her heart full. "So are we." That night, as she lay beside him for the first time in the small back room they'd made their own, she rested her head on his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his breath. The house creaked around them, old wood shifting as the warmth of their bodies filled the space. "We'll build it slow," she whispered, her hand resting over his. "Slow's the only way I know." And with that, she let her eyes close, knowing that nothing about their life was hurried, but everything was sure. By April, the earth had softened enough to take a spade straight in without resistance. The thaw brought with it a sound Willow hadn't realized she'd been missing: water trickling down through the creek near the edge of the land that was now theirs. Not on paper yet, but in every way that mattered. Quinn had handed over the payment in full a week after the frost let go, and the old man who owned it left on the morning train, leaving behind a rusted shovel, a leaning fence, and the blessing of a clean start. They walked the lines of it together most mornings before work began. Tessa perched on Quinn's shoulders, Toby trailing behind with a measuring stick he'd fashioned out of a fallen branch. Willow had taken to carrying a cloth notebook, drawing rough sketches of where the house would sit, where the herb beds could be tucked near the kitchen door, where she might plant gooseberries if the soil proved willing. That morning, Quinn paused near the rise they'd chosen for the house. He crouched beside a row of stakes they'd set and pressed his palm into the earth. "It's good ground," he said. "Firm underneath." Willow glanced down at the heel of her boot, half sunk in the wet soil. "It'll need drainage dug. I'll do that first. Amos offered a hand, but I told him we can manage." She let her gaze travel to the horizon where the ridgeline cut clean against the sky. "We're really doing it." He looked up at her, squinting into the sun. "You ever doubt we would?" I think I stopped doubting the day you stayed. That afternoon, Mary kept the children while Willow rode into town with a small parcel of dried herbs and a list of supplies. The saddle pinched her hips more than she remembered, but she was glad for the solitude. The road into Missoula had dried enough to make travel easy, with only a few patches of stubborn mud to slow the mare's pace. As she passed the river curve, she saw men casting lines into the shallows, their breath visible in the morning chill. She reached the mercantile just after noon, tied her horse, and stepped inside. The shopkeeper, Mr. Hawley, had been one of the first to welcome her back in the early days, when she'd still been skittish and thin with worry. Today he gave a polite nod, eyes going to the bundle in her arms. "Back again, Miss Langford?" She smiled. "Just Willow now." He nodded, then gestured to the counter. "You bring more of that cough tonic?" She unwrapped the parcel and laid the jars out. "And a salve for cracked skin. Mary's been using it on the little one's cheeks. Said it worked better than the stuff from back east." He took one, opened it, and sniffed. "Smells like pine and something else? Wild violet, steeped in lard." He set it down with care. "I'll take the lot. Word's gotten around. You might think about keeping a shelf here." "I might." She traded the jars for salt, flour, and a small tin of nails, just enough to start laying the floor joists. As she turned to leave, Mr. Hawley cleared his throat. "Word is you and that fella Barrett bought the old Dunmore place." She paused. "We did." He nodded slowly. "Good bones on that land. And you'll make it better. Folks notice when someone sticks." She met his eyes. "We're not going anywhere." She rode back slower, the weight of the supplies pulling at her saddle. By the time she reached the house, the sun had dropped behind the trees and the air held the bite of evening. Quinn met her at the gate, took the parcels without a word, and pressed a kiss to her cheek as she dismounted. They worked by lantern light that night, sorting nails and checking the timber Quinn had milled with Amos. Toby sat on the floor, sketching a crude layout of the coop, while Tessa colored in a square of fabric with chalk. Later, as the children slept, Willow sat in the lean-to. They were still calling home, brushing sawdust from her skirt. Quinn sat beside her, his hands streaked with pitch. "You're tired," she said. "Feels like the kind of tired that means something." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We'll sleep better once we've got our own roof." "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Once the floor's in and the frame's up, we can move in even if the walls aren't finished." She tilted her head. "You want to live in a skeleton of a house? I want to wake up in the place we're building, even if it's just beams and canvas for a while." She considered that. "I'd like that too." By early May, the floor was down, the frame raised, and a canvas sail stretched over the beams to keep out the worst of the rain. It wasn't a house yet, not by most standards, but it was theirs. Willow moved their blankets in on a Monday evening, arranging them under one of the corner joists where the wind didn't reach. Tessa was delighted with the echo of her voice under the open beams, and Toby claimed a corner for his tools, hammering pegs into the low studs. That night, they ate bread and boiled beans by lantern light, the children curled up between them. Willow rested her hand over Quinn's, the calluses of his palm familiar now, grounding. "We'll put the walls up next week," he said. "Then the stove. And curtains," she added. "I finished the second set." He looked at her, eyes soft. "It's not just a house anymore." "No," she said. "It's home." By June, the house had 4 walls, a roof shingled with cedar shakes, and a porch that overlooked the field. The coop stood beside the shed, and the herb garden had taken root. Green shoots pushing through the soil Willow had turned with her own hands. Quinn had carved their initials into the porch rail, not where anyone would see unless sitting close, but she noticed it one evening while shelling peas. She traced the letters with her thumb, her heart full. On the first Sunday of summer, Mary and Amos came with a basket of preserves and the children ran barefoot through the field. They ate on the porch, passing jars and laughter, the sun warm on their shoulders. After they left and the children had fallen asleep in their small loft, Willow and Quinn sat in the doorway watching the sky bruise into night. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. "You ever think we'd get here?" She looked out at the land, the fence lines, the house they'd built board by board. "I didn't think I'd ever want anything again. But you made space for it. You never asked me to be anything I wasn't." "I just wanted you," he said quietly. She leaned in, kissed him slow, the way one gives thanks when words won't do. They sat there until the stars came out, until the wind quieted. And when they rose, it was to go inside together, into a home they had made with care, with patience, with love earned slow and sure. Years later, the house still stood, weathered but strong. The herb shed had been expanded twice, and Willow's jars lined the shelves of the mercantile in town. People came from as far as Stevensville for her salves and teas. Quinn ran a small team of draft horses, hauling timber in the winter and plowing fields in spring. Toby, now nearly grown, was apprenticing with a carpenter. Tessa spent her days near the creek, pressing flowers into books and asking questions about the world. In the evenings, Willow and Quinn sat on the porch they had built, their hands still finding each other without thought. The land stretched quiet before them, the fields golden in the last light of day. "I never needed grandeur," she said once, as the sun slipped behind the ridge. "Just this, just us." Quinn pulled her close, his voice low and steady. "And you'll always have it." And she did. Always.